I'm Sam Kemble. Welcome to Labor Market and Industrial Relations Review, a podcast by Workforce Delivery Inc. We conduct a management-side educational commentary that focuses on industrial relations, employment supply-demand, and employment administration. We review workforce management and labor market trends and focus on areas that we believe will be of interest to those in private sector settings in Western Canada. We are an apolitical organization and podcast. At times, we will weigh into politics and public policy issues, but only in relation to their impact on management-union relations, employment opportunities, the sustainability of our capital investment climate, together with their impact on labor market dynamics in Western Canada. We hope that you enjoy our show, and if you do, please subscribe for future updates or visit us at workforcedelivery.com. Welcome to our Respect in the Workplace series, and today we'll be speaking about respect in the workplace in a post-Me Too environment from an employer's perspective. By way of offering clarification and hopefully to avoid potential for miscommunication, we start by saying that in order to do this segment, we absolutely do need offer a definition of what the Me Too movement is and what the Time's Up movement is. We've gathered some sources to cite that describe both movements, I think, in a fairly objective way. But we are not the ones to speak on behalf of either movement. We are the first to acknowledge that. Myself and my firm are allies, and we're properly allies situated from the sidelines, which is where most allies from each movement should be. So I just want to make sure that it's clear that it is not our intention in any way to be speaking on behalf of either movement. We will be looking at some organizations' response to it, some good, some bad, and that's the area we want to focus our discussion, which is a management-side human resource response to the Me Too movement in organizations in Canada. Now, to qualify ourselves to speak about that, I offer that in the last few years, actually from 2012 to 2015, we assisted in the hiring and mobilizing of 27,000 Canadians to construction sites across Western Canada. Including, I might add, when we could help, we focused our efforts on hiring from depressed areas of Ontario when the auto sector was hurting and projects in the West were able to help out. In fact, we achieved about a 12.5% Ontario recruitment rate in many projects in the West during that time frame. But overall, we have a fairly wide sampling of individuals that we've worked with and recruited. And unlike other recruiters, we've typically met people at the gate. So it's not like we recruited and said, see you later. We actually met people up on the project and then managed those individuals from an HR and LR perspective during their tenure on the project. That includes in respect to behavior and performance management needs, travel needs, and camp needs. Through this, we've encountered, in addition, hundreds, actually thousands of investigations that we've performed in regards to all kinds of areas of performance management, whether it be safety rule violations, alcohol and drug work rule violations, respect in the workplace violations. We've done it all. In regards to the respect in the workplace violations, that would include sexual harassment, racial harassment, discrimination, bullying, violence, both on and off the work site. So we've accumulated some real street smart or in the trenches experience in regards to doing human resources and respect in the workplace investigations on a massive scale. In addition to that, I was the co-chair of the Respect in the Workplace Committee for the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, and together with Lori Miller, we actually drafted the founding documents, the founding policy, that being the Respect in the Workplace document, which was an integrative policy that included bullying, harassment, and violence rolled into one integrated work rule. This work rule was adopted and mobilized not only on construction sites, but also by a number of other employers, including governmental employers across Canada. This is because we've developed intentionally to be open sourced and adopted across Canada. We hope this clarifies or at least locates us in terms of the vantage point from which we will be speaking to you today. We hope that you enjoy the segment and look forward to your comments. Okay, it's time to get into the respect in the workplace policy frameworks and how they're impacted by the Me Too and the Time's Up movement. So what are the real impacts? What are the perceived impacts? And how do organizations need to respond? Me Too is a movement that uses a hashtag that was originally created 10 years ago by Tarana Burke, a survivor herself of sexual harassment. The hashtag went viral after Alyssa Milano and a few others started to use it following or in the aftermath of the Harvey Weinstein sexual misconduct allegations. Weinstein is a former film producer and co-chairman of the Weinstein Company who engaged in some pretty horrendous behavior towards women that went unchecked for years and years in Hollywood. He may have been a catalyst, but the movement evolved to address the broader issue. The movement focused on increasing awareness to uncover the pervasiveness of sexual harassment in our society and has become a platform for primarily women to share personal experience of sexual harassment and abuse. And since, it's also evolved to be a platform for holding perpetrators accountable and responsible. And this is for the purpose of stopping this cycle. So the next question is, what is the Time's Up movement? The Time's Up movement is a movement that actually grew out of the Me Too movement and grew out of what was referred to as the Weinstein effect. And that was just the sheer amount of people that were coming forward and making serious sexual allegations against powerful and famous men. Sexual misconduct that these men had apparently been committing for years, that they were getting away with. It was really the action that follows from the awareness created by Me Too. As of February 2018, Time's Up accumulated a $200 million legal defense fund, together with about 200 volunteer lawyers. They were willing to donate time to protect and represent individuals who had been subjected to sexual harassment in the past. The motto on the website of the Time's Up movement is "The time's run out on sexual assault, harassment, and inequality in the workplace. It is time to do something about it." So the Time's Up movement started in Hollywood, and what we saw was incidents in the news being reported. There were a lot of Hollywood figures that were being named, and then there was some activity that I was aware of occurring in various news organizations in the States, where there were some higher profile sexual harassment cases. Beyond that, I'm not really familiar with what went on in the States, what trajectory the Time's Up movement had in the United States, only because I had not been tracking it specifically. What I did notice, just like many of us did, is we started to see evidence that the movement was taking shape and starting to have an effect in Canada. This was a good thing, and we saw some higher profile sexual harassment allegations that were made primarily Ottawa, and also in various political organizations within federal and provincial party organizations. In addition, there was an allegation of a fairly high-profile theater company of sexual misconduct in nature. So we were seeing a higher increased level of awareness and an increased willingness to act and respond. A disposition to confront, if you will, among women in Canada who are subject to different levels of sexual harassment, misconduct, abuse, and discrimination. This is a good thing. One of the very instructive responses that kind of jumped out at me was from Michelle Rempel, who explained the prior practice of using the Whisper Network. It was a gossip chain that women would use to tell each other when they saw something or heard something, as a means to manage incidents of harassment. What Honorable Rempel is referring to, and I've heard this from other sources, is that female staffers in government, instead of confronting a male counterpart of significant power directly, they would manage the issue laterally among themselves in order to protect themselves from increased harassment exposure. They would pass along messages like, "Don't be in an elevator alone with that guy," and things of that nature. So there was this gossip thing happening where women staffers were trying to protect each other from being exposed to the potential for sexual harassment. And this was instead of confronting the individual. And to be clear, this is not about victim blaming. What Miss Rempel is saying is that was and used to be the main way of addressing the behavior, and that can no longer be the way to address it. That organizations have to step up and confront the behavior directly. So that was that. Very clear, and what I would call an instructive response. Also, Rempel indicated this privilege system relied upon by perpetrators does nothing to protect victims, nothing to empower them, nothing to comfort them, and nothing to encourage reporting abuse, nothing to prevent violence, sexual or otherwise, from happening, and nothing to prevent vexatious complaints from being made. This parliamentary privilege that Rempel is referring to actually ties into a bit of a nuance that would be unique to legislatures and parliament, political parties and political organizations. Primarily, male parliamentarian perpetrators stood behind parliamentary privilege, and this is the sense, it instilled the sense that you are not subject to the same standards of behavior that other people and those in other employment scenarios would be subjected to. So I will say that Parliament has not exactly been an informative place to look in terms of demonstrating how most companies have been behaving and treating this issue for years. But in any event, Rempel stood up and gave notice, as did a number of other MPs, and they put their foot down and indicated that this parliamentary privilege is not going to be a shield that men in Parliament could rely upon in the future, and it's about time. Again, it is a very instructive and crystal clear response to signal as to where things need to go, should have gone, but in any event need to go in a post-Me Too and a post-Time's Up environment. Then it got weird. We started to see cases in Canada arising for which the organizational responses were less instructive. In fact, it was confusing. Now, again, I'm not talking about the allegations themselves so much as the organizational responses to them. So I reiterate, where I offer critique, I'm not talking about the movements themselves. The Me Too movements and the Time's Up are independent from how organizations choose to respond to them and how organizations respond to allegations. So what is happening here? I will use the NDP as an example just because this was a fairly clean and dispassionate example. But before taking a deep dive here, I want to acknowledge there have been other missteps. Patrick Brown comes to mind, one from the Conservatives. This isn't limited to one party or the other. But Patrick Brown's is quite messy, and there's a lot to that one, I think, about him, which confuses the issue. Instead, I just want to raise this in terms of how organizations respond to the harassment allegation, and less about analyzing the allegation itself. I'll leave that for others to do. Recent responses to harassment allegations puts in front of us the issue I want to discuss, and the example I put forward happens to come from the NDP's federal caucus. At the heart of this occurrence is a member of Parliament, an NDP caucus member, who had sent an email. At this point in time, there appeared to be no live issue. Mr. Aaron Weir sent an email to his NDP members of Parliament colleagues indicating that he had an interest in putting his name forward for caucus chair. In a reply to all email, a political rival, Christine Moore, also of the NDP caucus, but a political rival perhaps for the caucus chair position, replied to all and indicated that you are the last person in caucus I would like to see have this position, and then went further to allege, without naming any staffers or incidents or behaviors, but just to indicate that various women have said they are uncomfortable with being in Mr. Weir's office. It is not clear to many as to why she would have known that, given Mr. Weir's constituency office is in Regina, Saskatchewan, and Christine Moore's riding is in northern Quebec. It was not clear there was a complaint, if there was a complainant, or what the complaint might be about. Indeed, that seemed to be where Mr. Weir was, when he went on to CTV's question period with Evan Solomon the week following. Aaron Weir indicated that he didn't even know what was being alleged, and he was willing to participate in an investigation, but he didn't know what the investigation was ultimately going to be about, and was not aware of any incident that may have given rise to, or that would have been the triggering event giving rise to the allegation. I think at this time there was some public intuition, if you will, a bit of questioning among men and women in the public as to what's going on here. There doesn't seem to be due process, or there seems to be a lack of natural justice. In terms of the natural justice part, that's just an individual having the opportunity to face his or her accuser, which just means to know what is being alleged about him or her, and offered the opportunity to give an explanation. In any event, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh held a press conference. So the leader of NDP goes quickly out into the public and declares, "The first step is always to believe the survivors. We need to believe the survivors." Well, hold on a second. First of all, I've done a number of these investigations, and we don't call complainants survivors. There are complainants to respect in the workplace policies, and there are respondents to respect in the workplace policies, not survivors. Holocaust survivors are survivors. Residential school survivors are survivors. Sexual assault survivors are survivors, but not this. To be clear, I'm not talking about criminal cases or in terms of sexual assault. I'm talking about low-level interactions that get addressed at the employment and administrative law level. Like, I'm not talking about criminal justice. That's for someone else to speak about. I'm just talking about organizational administrative law, usually in the employment context. So when an individual raises a complaint or an issue pursuant to the respect in the workplace policy or harassment policy, they're called complainants. And they're called complainants for a reason. One reason is we don't know if the complaint is valid or until there's been an investigation. What has occurred here without having any facts or any time spent trying to understand the other side of the story is the leader of the NDP jumps in a very public way to announcing that he has to believe the survivor. In this case, there isn't even any survivor, or more accurately, there's no complainant identified. There's no known complainant, just an allegation from a political rival. So you know that brings about concerns, and I think it started to get people to ask questions about the lack of inquiry. Again, it's not the Time's Up movement or the Me Too movement that people started to question. It was how organizations were reacting to this. Because there is value in the principle of natural justice into processing these issues that the general public correctly expects. Both men and women want to see a high integrity policy and an incident response system in place that's not just about mob justice, and it's not a harassment policy that can be weaponized by individuals for other purposes. In any event, in an interview later with Evan Solomon's question period, Aaron Weir did mention, almost reluctantly, he noted that the attack came as a response to his announcing his candidacy for caucus chair. So there was a hint or a sense that this whole thing might have been politically motivated. But the consequences arising out of this is Jagmeet Singh suspended Mr. Weir's duty until the investigation was complete. I think many in the public perceive that to be harsh as well. In the absence of nothing that would seem to be apparent that needed to be addressed on an urgent basis, no facts that would suggest that needed to be the case, i.e., interim actions required to control an imminent risk. So why the knee-jerk response? So here's where we see a bit of a break in the perception of this file, questioning where things are going and how companies and organizations should respond. It didn't help that Jagmeet Singh used the alleged incident to politicize the event and virtue signal. It was a highly visible example, one put forward by, again, one of the poorest performers in Canada, that being a political party. Having said that, despite its visibility, it does not reflect where the balance of Canada's employers are. Nevertheless, it does raise expectations. It confuses the issue in the general public. It also confuses employees of organizations who have been doing it right in terms of where the lines are drawn. And I think overall in the long term, however, I think it is a good and healthy discussion, but that doesn't mean there's going to be some friction, isn't going to be friction, hopefully constructive, as individuals and employers and organizations reset where the lines are drawn once again. But just for now, we need to reset. We need to reset a few perceptions, just because our experience to date tells us that getting a few key concepts right is needed in order to be successful. And I think some of the news stories has certain people confused, and that's natural. We can clearly see how we got here, but we just need to reset it. We need to carry on in order to have a productive conversation on this. So first, because of all the sensationalization and high-profile nature of a number of the cases that have come up, and the publicity around it, the idea of confidentiality has been distorted. First of all, because of the sensationalization and the high-profile nature of a number of cases that have come up and the publicity around it, the idea of confidentiality has been distorted. And confidentiality is a very important principle in responding to respect in the workplace allegations. It is an employee's personnel file, a personal personnel file, and that is still the case. The Me Too movement and Time's Up movement responses never change that. Confidentiality is still appropriate. Also, just because something's confidential, that doesn't mean organizations are not doing something about it. And I think that needs to be restored. My head snapped back, actually, listening to a CBC power panel discussion where Ian Capstick seemed to suggest that a lot of these investigations needed to be fully transparent, open, and in fact 360. Transparency may be appropriate in the political realm, but when it comes to a human resource or an organizational response to harassment allegations, that requires an investigation first to determine what's going on. And investigations need to be conducted in a dignified and confidential manner. And then conclusions and findings need to be released to the appropriate parties only. But the other thing is expectations need to be toned down. Yes, Me Too and Time's Up have brought down a lot of high-profile, powerful people who've been getting away with horrible behavior for quite some time, which is a good thing. Now, we have to watch the emotions around that. And an emotion can build up and a certain mob justice expectation can arise. And that can build, and that building momentum can spin out of control. I think we just see that expectation that the hammer's going to fall regardless when any allegation is made or an investigation is launched. Someone has to remember that these are human issues. Human relation issues are complex, and there's usually 15 sides to each story, so it is complex. And to say that it's not complex would be dishonest. We are usually dealing with interpersonal conflict, so we need to appreciate the complexity and understand that there are going to be misperceptions. Some will simply feel harmed when they haven't been, and that can happen. Some people who have been harmed and raised complaints, it's in fact confirmed that they've been harmed, and to such a degree that the offending individual has to leave. In other times, in other cases, people are harmed, but not to the degree they believe. And the harm is repairable, and it's possible for the two parties to move forward in a safe and dignified way, continuing to work together in the same organization. There are all kinds of iterations, permutations, probabilities that come about, but it's all pinned to the investigation. And the thing that needs to be restored is neutrality and the sanctity of the investigation. That is an absolute must. It is an absolute must, and it's still a good thing. So when Jagmeet Singh says we have to believe the survivors before having any facts, it's just completely the wrong message. People conducting respect in the workplace investigations need to be neutral. They need to be independent. The parties involved in the investigation need to be neutral. They need to act neutral in order to maintain the integrity of the investigation process. We will get into that on our segment on investigations, a later segment specifically dedicated to harassment investigations. I just want to mention or acknowledge that Canada, yes, is still reeling from the Jian Ghomeshi file, and that Jian Ghomeshi file did a lot of damage. Here you have someone who had a fairly high-profile interface with a lot of women, and yes, while he was found not guilty in the criminal court and court process, a lot of folks forget that it was not a failure as it relates to the organizational response. There was closure. That was not a bad news story. Jian Ghomeshi lost his job. He lost his career. Again, employers have and continue to have the ability to act and respond to this kind of thing. Employers with a policy and who operate properly and have been and continue to will be in good shape. Canada is not as bad as Ottawa, is not as bad as Hollywood. Now, to conclude this segment, I just want to talk about what employers need to do if they haven't already. And yes, an employer should have done a lot already regarding management of harassment and bullying in the workplace. But so everyone is clear, the day and age of not having a work rule specifically to address harassment, including sexual harassment in the workplace, are over. Even if your staff accidentally come to the right conclusion, you will be sued by either the person you terminate for not having a policy or the person that was asking for your protection because you didn't have a policy. Not only that, for these kinds of questions, how you get to the answer is almost just as important as getting the answer. It's like long division in grade 5. You got just as many points for showing your work as you did for getting the right answer. And just because these investigations and files are confidential in the first instance, that doesn't mean the decisions will not be reviewed by some kind of adjudicator, whether it be in a court or human rights tribunal or an arbitrator. Someone has the potential to review what's going on, and they need to see the steps you took to get the decisions that you arrived at. And in order to do that, you actually have to have a work rule and a policy and a standard established. For employers that have a good work rule already, like something like the Construction Owners Association Respect in the Workplace policy, or some iteration of it, or something similar to that kind of standard, then you're in good shape. What will probably happen is you can expect a few more files that arrive on your desk that get put forward because the expectations of some of your employees may be elevated. Treat this like it's a good thing, and it is a good thing. The nice thing about having an adequate work rule is it allows for an evolution in the relationship between you and your employees, and an evolution in the standards that you set for your employees. So expect that you will have some more investigation files come to you, and you're going to just have to step up the diligence and ensure that you have the investigations right, because that is what sets the framework for your response. I believe the manner in which a lot of these files and cases are going to be tested on is on how well your investigations are conducted, and making sure that investigations are not influenced either directly or indirectly by business considerations that are separate and apart from the allegations. Especially if it appears as though the company is motivated to let it slide when a manager that might be performing in a very high capacity in another area. And I guess that's the last point I want to make right now. And I've seen it. I've never condoned it, but I've seen it. The days where the person is just too good too valuable to the organization to manage his or her behavior are gone. So employers, get that out of your head. These things, you can't let them slide anymore. And in fact, you should not have let them slide in the first place. Today, you're absolutely going to get burned if people in your organization have that attitude. Nobody in your organization is too good to comply with the respect in the workplace policies, whether it's sexual harassment, general harassment, bullying, or violence. Like Ms. Rempel suggested, this behavior needs to be confronted directly and dealt with directly. Thank you.